Welcome, and thank you for standing by. All participants will be on listen only until the question and answer session of today's conference. As a reminder, today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, please disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to your first speaker, Mr. Mike Grossman. Sir, you may begin.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Good morning to most of you. Good afternoon to our friends in Europe. My name is Michael Grossman, and on behalf of my colleague Dina Vulpes, I'd like to welcome you to the first of our 2 webinars this week on REACH. These webinars are brought to you by the U.S. Commercial Service offices in White Plains, New York, Northern New Jersey, our U.S. mission to the European Union in Brussels, and our partner organization, ICF International. Before we get started, I'd like to go over some technical information. The audio portion of this webinar is listen-only mode. If you're having trouble logging onto the website, you can press *0 now or call the conferencing service technical support at 800-857-8777, option 3. Today's topic is Are You Ready for REACH 2013, featuring presentations by Flavie Guerin of our Commercial Service Office at the U.S. Mission to the EU and Mike Penman of Penman Consulting. The webinar will run up to 90 minutes total. After both of the presentations are complete, we'll open up for questions. You'll be prompted by the operator if you'd like to ask your question verbally for all to hear. This method offers the opportunity for clarification or short follow-up if necessary. If you'd like to write out your question instead in our platform, you can do so at any time. Please see the Q&A tab at the top and enter your question there. Only the webinar leaders can see your questions, which will be relayed verbally to the presenters. We encourage you to ask questions and would like to provide as much value as possible. Importantly, to keep us on topic and in order to ensure that we cater to the entire audience during the webinar, we ask that you not ask questions that are very specific to your particular company or that will not be of interest to the majority of participants. However, you can, of course, follow up directly with the speakers with additional questions after this webinar. The speakers have also kindly made available their presentations in PDF format. To download the presentations directly at any point during this webinar, simply click on the Handouts tab. It's the 3 sheets of overlapping paper icon towards the top right of the screen. Our follow-up webinar will be on Thursday and is titled Communication Challenges, CLP Transition and Supply Chain Compliance. Our featured speakers will be Flavie Guerin once again, Dr. Candice Prusowitz of ICF International, and Georgine Adams of EHS Strategies. If you have not yet signed up for Part 2 and are interested in doing so, please be sure to register prior to Thursday. Before we move on, let me just briefly introduce our organization. We are the U.S. Commercial Service. My office is in White Plains, New York. The Commercial Service is a branch of the U.S. Department of Commerce and is the primary export promotion agency of the federal government. The Commercial Service counts on the expertise of trade specialists in approximately 100 cities across the U.S. in export assistance centers such as mine, and country industry specialists in U.S. embassies and consulates in almost 80 countries around the world. U.S. Commercial Service has a worldwide network of specialists ready to assist American companies to develop new business through extensive market research information, promoting your companies and products worldwide, assisting with finding qualified agents, distributors, or other partners in international markets, assisting with trade events, and much more. If you don't have a contact at your local Export Assistance Center, or if you'd like further information on our services and how we can help, please visit our website at www.export.gov. You can also feel free to contact me, and I can put you in touch with your local office. It's now my pleasure to introduce Ms. Flavie Guerin, who will talk about REACH fundamentals. And let me just go over Flavie's short bio quickly. Flavie joined the Commercial Service at the U.S. Mission to the EU in 2000. She is the mission's expert on EU environmental and regulatory issues. Her areas of expertise include EU chemical control, REACH and CLP, waste management, packaging waste, WE and ROS directives, and EU rules related to cosmetics. Flavie advises American companies on compliance with EU regulations. She publishes reports and counsels companies via individual sessions, seminars, webinars, and also at trade shows. Flavie also defends U.S. business interests through advocacy with EU institutions. She represents the United States and other EU trading partners at the EU's Competent Authority meeting on the REACH regulation. She advises American officers from U.S. agencies on environmental and regulatory issues. Her achievements on REACH have been recognized by the U.S. government through several awards. Prior to joining the U.S. mission, Flavie worked as a consultant for the European Commission and for KPMG. And now I'll pass it over to Flavie. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, and good morning, everyone. Michael, can we move to my presentation on the screen?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so REACH has been in force for 5 years. The first wave of registration is behind us, but REACH is not over. There's a new registration deadline in 2013. The authorization and evaluation processes on the REACH are just starting, and the candidate list is ever expanding. During this webinar, you will hear how U.S. companies are affected and what you or your representative need to know to be fully in compliance with REACH. I will start with a general overview of REACH. It will be a bit basic for some of you, but it's important for those who are new to REACH and also because REACH is such a complex legislation. I will focus on the upcoming deadline for registration, REACH 2013, and I will cover obligations related to the so-called SVHCs, the substances of very high concern. My presentation will take 15 minutes. REACH is the system for controlling chemicals in the EU. It entered into force in 2007. The EU is trying to balance the different objectives of REACH, protecting health and the environment, and promoting innovation and competitiveness of EU industry. REACH is about the safe use of chemicals and places the responsibility on industry to ensure the safe use of chemicals. REACH is managed by ECHA, the European Chemicals Agency, and member states are responsible for enforcing REACH. They are the ones who impose penalties for non-compliance. REACH stands for the registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction of chemicals. REACH requires registration of all chemicals manufactured and imported in quantities above 1 ton per year. Companies must submit a dossier of information about the substance to ECHA. We're talking here about 30,000 substances above 1 ton that need to be registered over a period of 11 years ending in 2018. One key principle of REACH is no data, no market. A chemical which is not registered cannot be used anymore. Evaluation. Registration dossiers are evaluated by ECHA, who may ask industry to generate more data. ECHA is also coordinating the evaluation by member states of specific chemicals of concern. The authorization process focuses on substances of very high concern, SVHCs. When they are listed on Annex 14 of REACH, they are banned after a certain date unless authorized for specific uses. Restrictions. Annex 17 is the list of restricted substances, and it's really important to check Annex 17 to make sure that you do not export restricted substances to the EU. For example, there is a new ban on cadmium in plastic in the EU, which is coming into force in December. Products covered. REACH does not only affect chemicals, but all supply chains producing and using chemicals. REACH covers substances as such, substances in preparations or mixtures like paints, cosmetics, detergents, and substances in articles, finished products. An article is defined in the legislation as an object whose shape and design are more important to its function than its chemical composition. So most sectors in industry are covered by REACH: chemical, textile, electronics, automotive, etc. Any exemptions? Yes. Substances below 1 ton do not need to be registered. REACH starts at 1 ton. Some substances are totally exempted from REACH. Radioactive substances, substances under customs supervision, non-isolated intermediates, waste. Some substances are exempted from certain procedures under REACH, medicinal products, food and feed, they do not need to be registered. Polymers do not need to be registered, but monomers in imported polymers need to be registered. Substances in cosmetics, they must be registered, but the health aspects are covered by the Cosmetics Directive. Medical devices, they are exempt from authorization. Annex 4 and 5 include substances with minimal risk, like substances occurring in nature. They don't need to be registered. Active substances in biocides and pesticides are deemed registered, and there are national exemptions in the interest of defense. So who are the main players in REACH within industry? Most of the REACH obligations fall on EU manufacturers and importers. They must submit a registration dossier to ECHA and provide relevant information to the users. Non-EU-based manufacturers do not have direct obligations on the REACH. Your importer must comply with the regulation, but you have the option, in particular if you don't want to disclose confidential business information to your importers, to appoint a representative in Europe called the only representative. This OR will fulfill all obligations of the importer and in particular will register your substances. And Mike will cover in detail the role and duties of the only representative in his presentation. Downstream users in REACH include any business using chemicals. They must be based in the EU. Downstream users do not need to register, but they must communicate their uses to their suppliers for registration and also pass safety information. So downstream users and distributors also have to check their REACH compliance. The entire supply chain is involved. Registration. The registration deadline depends on the tonnage band and the hazardous properties of the substance. High-volume chemicals were registered in November last year. The next deadline is in May 2013, in a year and a half. That's for substances above 100 ton. And for low-volume chemicals, the deadline is in 2018. So these two deadlines will affect more SMEs. Substances covered by the 2013 deadline are substances manufactured or imported in quantities above 100 tons per year. The deadline applies to substances as such, in preparations and in articles. And there's a condition for the registration of substances in articles. The substance must be intended to be released. That's for, the example of chemicals in cleaning wipes. They are intended to be released and must be registered if above 1 ton. For 2013, substances must have been pre-registered. Pre-registered substances benefit from extended registration deadlines. If you miss the pre-registration deadline, which was in 2008, you can do a late pre-registration if you are exporting for the first time with limited information. If not, you must register immediately and do a full registration. Who can register? Well, only EU manufacturers and importers can register. If you have a subsidiary in Europe, they can do the registration for you. If you export to Europe, you cannot register yourself, but your product needs to be registered. Your importer will have to register, or you have the option to hire an only representative, as I mentioned, which is established in the EU to register on your behalf. And you can also rely on the registration of your supplier if he agrees to cover your volumes as part of his indirect imports into the EU. But in all three cases, you'll have to provide the relevant information so that they can register and to ensure market access for your products. How to register? Companies must submit a registration dossier with information on the substance properties, uses, and safety measures. For substances above 10 tons, REACH requires a chemical safety report consisting of a chemical safety assessment and a risk management plan. And you will hear from Mike what's needed in a registration dossier. The dossier must be submitted to the European Chemicals Agency in a software called Euclid and consisting of a common part prepared with other registrants of the same substance and an individual part with company-specific information. To prepare your dossier, you will need to share data with others in a SIF, Substance Information Exchange Firm. SIFs bring together businesses registering the same substance. To register, the first step is to form or join an existing SIF. As an exporter to the EU, it's your OR or your importer will be represented in the SIF, but that's important that you are informed about what's happening in the SIF and as well of the progress of the registration dossier. The second step, companies in the SIF will share data. Third step, they will prepare and submit the joint and individual dossier. On the chart, you can see on the first line that companies registering the same substance form a SIF, one substance, one SIF. Then each SIF nominates a lead registrant who prepares the joint dossier and sends it on behalf of SIF members to ECHA. On the second line, the co-registrants prepare and submit their individual dossier and pay a registration fee to ECHA, which depends on the tonnage of the substance and the size of the company. And there is also a data fee to get access to the common part of the dossier, the so-called letter of access, which depends on the number of companies sharing the cost within the SIF and how many studies they need. Challenges for 2013. The Commission is currently carrying out a review of REACH to see what's working well, what should be improved. The results of this review are due in June, but there are already some lessons that can be drawn from the first phase of registration. In 2010, 86% of registrations were done by large companies who were well organized in large consortia and had most of the data available. Still, there were difficulties in the SIFs. It was difficult to find companies who wanted to be the lead registrant, so that delayed the whole process. And communication within the SIFs was difficult. Discussions on data and cost sharing were time-consuming. ECHA has warned also that the quality of dossier was not always good and needs to be improved. So 2010 has showed that putting together a dossier can really be a challenge. In 2013, there is less data available for substances to be registered in 2013, and there will be more inexperienced companies and more SMEs in the SIF. So that should be another challenge. Preparing for 2013, ECHA has launched a campaign for REACH 2013 called Act Now, and you see the logo here on your right. ECHA's advice for successful registration is an early start, a good preparation, and a good communication within the SIF. And you can find on ECHA's website the recommended deadlines to register on time for 2013. SIFs should be formed by the end of the year. Chemical safety assessment should be done by the end of 2012. The joint dossier should be submitted by the lead registrant by March 2013 to give time to other registrants to submit their individual dossier by the 31st of May 2013, which is the legal deadline. The others are just a recommendation to help you meet the 2013 deadline. SVHC obligations. So first, what are SVHCs? SVHCs are hazardous substances and include CMRs, carcinogens, mutagens, and substances toxic to reproduction. PBTs, persistent bioaccumulative and toxic substances. VPVBs, very persistent and very bioaccumulative substances, and substances of equivalent concern like endocrine disruptors. SVHCs may be placed on two lists, the candidate list and the authorization list. Substances identified as SVHCs are put on the candidate list. The candidate list is available on the ECHA website and is updated twice a year. There are currently 53 substances on the candidate list, including plasticizers, flame retardants, and there is a political objective to have 136 substances on the candidate list by the end of 2012. The candidate list is the first step in the authorization process, which bans substances unless they are authorized for specific uses. The candidate list is not a list of banned substances, but it has a blacklist effect because it's an indication that these substances could be banned in the near future, and your EU customers will ask you for products that do not contain substances on the candidate list. The candidate list creates legal obligations for companies. If your products contain substances on the candidate list, you have an obligation to inform your customers of the presence of SVHCs above 0.1% in your products so that they can use them safely. That's the communication obligation under Article 33. And there is also a duty to notify ECHA of the presence of SVHCs in Article when the substance is on the candidate list in concentration above 0.1% and in quantities above 1 ton per year. That's Article 7.2. Management of SVHCs in the supply chain can be quite a challenge, and we'll discuss this in more detail during our session on Thursday. The objective of authorization, that's the A in the REACH acronym, is to ensure that the risks from SVHCs are properly controlled and promote as well substitution of dangerous chemicals by safer ones. The authorization list is also known as Annex 14 of REACH. Substances on the authorization list are banned unless authorized for specific uses. Companies applying for authorization must demonstrate that risks are adequately controlled or that socioeconomic benefits outweigh the risks and there is no available substitute. There are currently 6 substances on the authorization list, including muscxylene used in cosmetics and DEHP used as a plasticizer. They will be banned in the next 3 to 5 years unless an authorization is granted to any individual company for a specific use. And the list will expand. The next update will be early next year. Authorization does not apply to imported articles, but imported articles are subject to restrictions and notification to ECHA. I've summarized here the REACH obligation for background information, with the registration process which applies to chemicals above 1 ton, and the specific requirements for articles, notification and communication requirements if they contain SVHCs on the candidate list. We'll be talking more about articles containing hazardous substances on Thursday. And with that, this is the end of my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Flavie. Now I'd like to introduce Mike Penman to talk about the practicalities of REACH, business planning to registration. Mike is a managing director of Penman Consulting, a company with origins with its origins in the petrochemical and oil industry that has rapidly gained recognition for its ability to deliver on regulatory and science issues. Formed in 2007 by Mike after over 30 years of direct experience in the chemical and petrochemical industries, ICI and ExxonMobil, as a toxicologist, and managing science and regulatory programs, Penman Consulting has grown quickly to encompass other specialist skills and resources to service clients' needs, including product stewardship, product management, scientific aspects, as well as IT. Mike has been involved in managing the business process and or overseeing the technical work for literally hundreds of substances that have been used in thousands of REACH registrations. He has also designed software tools to cope with the complexity of registrant and CEF management for some major consortia, as well as product stewardship tools for companies. Mike chaired one of the critical REACH implementation projects, Information Requirements Scoping Study, and worked on the final delivery of the guidance documentation. He was awarded a UK Civil Honor for services to environmental safety in 1997. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike.
Thank you very much, Mike. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation to speak here this afternoon. And thank you for the wonderful introduction. I don't know where you got it from. It's very good indeed. Okay. When we were approached really to kind of talk on the commercial services webinar, which we're very pleased to do so, what I thought would be interesting was actually to see, what's happening in terms of what's the practicalities of what you have to do. If you're not used to regulatory affairs, and if you're not used to having to deal with a bunch of crazy European technocrats, it's quite an intimidating process. My aim today really is to try and take you through a bit about the implications for you. If you're sitting on this as a new journey for you, there's some things you need to understand, I think, before you start the process. It's quite a long road, and you want to be prepared for it along the way. Certainly, we're all working in a market economy, and we want to try and understand what our potential costs are. It's the only reason we're doing the whole job. If you're marketing, selling, or being a consultant like me, that's really why we're here, although we do love it, of course, as well. If you are going to do things in Europe, you will have to have a legal entity in Europe. Someone's going to have to represent you. That, for many American companies, I know is a significant challenge, and how they organize that. So we're going to talk probably more at length than I would normally do in a presentation about the potential for the only representative, kind of the what, the who, and the why of them, really. And once you're in there, how do you get to the data that you need? How do you find the people you've got to talk to? How do you talk to them? Again, not really necessarily a very easy process. You'll find yourselves in a strange bedfellows, people from the Far East, people from Russia, Lithuania, you name it. We've probably dealt with people from a huge number of countries in the last few years who it's been really quite a challenge culturally to deal with some people. They don't have the same attitudes as you do. They will be different. And so the ways of behaving and working in businesses are different. And that's why I think the webinar today and the people that are serving you an excellent job to get done. And actually then physically, how do you prepare? In some ways, kind of doing the practical work at the end, or it's the easy bit. How do you prepare and you submit your dossier? And then the bit that no one's really talked about much before you set out is actually what happens once you put this dossier in. It doesn't stop, I'm afraid. There's an English expression that dog is for life, not just for Christmas, when people used to give dogs for Christmas and then they'd be out on the streets on January the 3rd. Unfortunately, a REACH is for life, not just for the registration deadline, so it carries on a fair while. I'm a consultant, and I'm given a platform, so just to say who you're listening to. We're a Brussels-based consultancy. I've worked in the chemical and oil industry, as Mike said before, and regulatory toxicology values. But we've grown quite a strong technical team here, providing a number of services. Our strategic partners certainly in North America are ICF, who are also talking on Thursday of this week, who we've done a lot of work with in REACH projects in Europe, serving some very large clients indeed, and large consortia in that process. So we, just to say who we are really, small team, about 12 of us. Now, before you kind of get dug in and start, and you kind of rush off and commit yourself to anything. The regulatory context, as Flavia said, is this wonderful phrase in REACH of no data, no market. And it was coined, and it's in kind of bold letters, and bold italic letters at the beginning of the regulation virtually. And what it means really is if you haven't got any information on your product, you're not going to have a market. You will not be allowed to market it because you won't be able to register it. So the days of actually people having substances where they kind of beg, borrow, steal information for a data sheet from somewhere else and get it onto the market is not there. This whole regulation was driven by the view of many of the NGOs and some of the member states that chemicals that were being put onto the market for the first time, the new chemicals, were very restricted because you had to have a certain data package to put them on. But for those chemicals that were already on the market, you didn't have to do anything. And so that's what drove a lot of this going forward. So, so we have this registration, evaluation, authorization, and restriction. And as Flavia says, all substances manufactured, and she went through this very nicely, so I'm not going to repeat it. It replaced a heck of a lot of existing European directives on chemical risk assessment and supply chain communication. And that's someone who's worked in kind of toxicology, environment, and regulatory affairs for a long time. It's been a very concentrated time of almost putting all our knowledge into a regulation going forward. I don't necessarily agree with it at all. I think it's over the top bureaucratic, but it certainly made us think very hard on what we're doing. Understanding the implications of getting involved, and it's not a fright to just say you don't understand that the practical things, which registration types. Before you even start, you have to understand that if you're going to register it as a substance, that's going to be more expensive for you than if you were going to register it as an intermediate, i.e. a chemical that is going to get used in synthesis down the supply chain. So there's no potential for wide consumer and environmental exposure. But having said that, and we've had a huge round on intermediates versus substances in Europe, the Commission are pushing very hard on people who did register as intermediates now, after the registration, for them to prove that they're handling that chemical in what's called a strictly controlled condition. So even when you think you've found a way of doing it, perhaps in a lighter touch, there is a downside post-registration on you. So there's a lot to consider beginning. There are exemptions, exemptions both from certain chemicals, but exemptions from certain information requirements, certain work to do. Again, to go into them just is a long talk in itself. But you need to understand what they are. Deadlines, as Flavia said, based on tonnage alone, so it's purely a tonnage-driven process in terms of deadlines. There is a legal requirement, effectively, to work with your co-producers/importers. As I said before, that can be quite a strange thing for people who's not used to doing it. If you're normally used to dealing with a North American market and you find yourself dealing with someone who comes from Romania, and the data and the ethic of how you share costs and how you share those work processes, that's an interesting one for you. Users must be registered. People tend to think about REACH as being a way of getting more hazard data in. So, let's poison more rats and kill more fish, and then we'll know how dangerous the chemical is. The whole point of REACH really was to do that, and on top of it was to register the use. So every use that you have must be registered. And if you don't register the use, you cannot use it. And if you are a dangerous substance, then you must risk assess that use. Hence my next point, which is it's covering both the intrinsic hazard and the risk. And you're probably getting the feeling, well, I'll count it, but the other thing, as Flavia said, there's electronic data entry and an electronic registration process. The days of having large dossiers in paper have disappeared. Having said that, if you did print all of this out, it would be several inches of paperwork on your desk. There's no two ways about it. It's for most of the regulation. And of course, not only are you going to have to pay people to put dossiers together for you, to get test data and all the rest of it, you also have to pay a registration fee. We ran the olefins and aromatics industry registration efforts for 2010. We had 51 companies and 140 substances within the consortia that we managed, and they were all the great and the good in the petrochemical world. from my old friends to many new Eastern Western ones, we calculate that the registration fees alone that they paid for the substances we manage, those 140 chemicals, was in excess of 25 million euros. So the industry is being taxed twice, if you like, in Europe at the moment. And it's probably worse if you're in Europe because you have to register all your materials on your plants. I think this is right, but there's about 28,000 pages of text, guidance, associated documentation. Nobody can know it all. So if you find someone who says they are the REACH expert or Dr. REACH or Mr. Know-all, take them with a strong pinch of salt. You'll find people who are knowledgeable and have been involved. You'll also find, plenty who can skim the surface for you. You're always going to need, to dig deep somewhere along the line to find exactly how you might do something. The other thing that's happening as well, I thought it's rather a boring slide, so I do apologise, but it's trying to get you to on a level. The regular update and the guidance. ECHA, in December 2010, after we had made a lot of submissions, the guidance on stricter control conditions and transported intermediates changed on us. So we are playing, and that's probably rather an English expression, but the goalposts are moved quite regularly for us. So they're changing a bit. And as there's a duty to keep things updated, you'll need to keep an eye on what's going on. The electronic systems are changing as well. The interpretation is changing all the time as the case law really is being defined. So the conclusion really is here, it's complex, it's resource intensive, it's ongoing, and you're on a treadmill. This is not to frighten you off, but you just have to understand what you're doing. The cost between 30 and 500,000 euros is not unrealistic. If you had to do all the high-end testing, that's probably about where you'd be. And as Flavia said, about 30,000 chemicals impacted above the 1 ton per year. So I hope that's not getting too worried. I just put a slide together of the common jargon. I think quite often, and certainly for the newcomer, it sounds very, very intimidating, and people talk about CIFs and CSAs and robust study summaries and all the rest of it. So I've just put some of the basic type things that you tend to know, you heard about, and try and make sense perhaps of some of my shorthand later on. So you will hear the word CIF for your CIF. Well, you need to know what that is. That it's a group of the potential registrants of the same substance. Unfortunately, the Commission put large posters up around Europe, including Brussels, saying, register, be safe, pre-register early. So lots of people submitted their chemicals, said they were going to register, and about 10% of them actually are. So the CIFs are a forest of people who with poor intentions very often, but the good ones are in there as well. The consortium, which we have managed a lot of, we've managed CIFs, the trouble with a CIF is that it has no legal context. You haven't got any legal levers inside a CIF. So that's why companies tend to form consortia with contracts between them, so you can then have a contractual framework in which to work. And the trick is to try and do that without spending the first year talking about the contract rather than talking about the work that has to be done. The registration dossier is pretty obvious. It's the data that's put into ECHA. Information requirements, we don't talk about data so much, but you have to meet prescribed intrinsic properties. So for each tonnage level, there are studies or information requirements that you need to meet. And you can obviously provide data for those from studies, or you can perhaps find a way around them by saying you're going to waive this because it doesn't actually, you can't do that study, or derogation or anything else. The next one is the chemical safety assessment, where you've put all this this data into the machine, and you actually get it out again, so you have a narrative text for the chemical safety assessment, and you come to your views about the intrinsic properties of the material and the classification and labeling. If you are hazardous, then you need to go to an exposure scenario where you describe the conditions of how you're going to control that substance in that particular use, with the appropriate risk management measures. And I've missed my capital M off there to give us the acronym RMM. So you'll hear lots of Europeans rabbiting on about RMMs. That's to have one line like that's kind of, 5-day seminar in itself for some people. And then when that's all written, and when you add the exposure scenarios, how they're written up into the chemical's intrinsic hazard, you end up with a chemical safety report, that you put into a PDF file and you put into an electronic file to give to the Commission. There are just a few acronyms to kind of wade through to kind of give you the scope of what we're after. I work for a large petrochem company, as Michael said, Exxon, and we were always very process-driven, so I like process maps and kind of try to get planning steps. So I'll probably show you this diagram or something like it a couple of times at least. But this is just to give you some of the highlights of the things that you need to do for the practical to get through to where we want the red line and the red box that's saying registration through before the time runs out. Taking you through steps of getting what chemicals you want to register, who's going to do the work, who you're going to get to do the work for you, how you're going to talk to the people that you might want to share data and processes with. If you know those people and you know how many there are, that could be a significant divisor in your costs. It's the biggest divisor before. If you can get more people to be sharing with, then you should be happy. Supply chain management, telling the communications up and down this so-called supply chain, which is a detailed bit on Thursday is never going to leave you. You're always going to have this flow of information going backwards and forwards. So you're having to think there about systems for doing that. And you have to think about how you're going to get hold of the information and get, who's going to collect it together, who's going to take that information and do an evaluation for you. If you haven't got all the information, then you have to think, well, perhaps you've got to do some testing to actually, if this is a required test and I don't have a genotoxicity assay telling me if the substance might be mutagenic or not, you might have to go and do that. Then you have to take all that information and stuff it in a dossier in a very prescribed way to make sense and write the story up, try and get the story for the substance through and put that together with your use and business information and exposure assessments to finally give you your chemical safety report, which is your risk characterization, and then you need to supply your safety data sheet, then you can get it registered. So these are the headlines on the way through, just to give you a feel for the kind of indicative planning steps. I put a little puzzled man in here, really to say, I've probably got you scraping your head already, saying, how the heck are we going to do this? It is tricky. I think there's a few very good pointers, though, from all the work that we did prior to 2010. We learned a huge amount from it. I think you learn how not to do things as much as how to do things. First of all, I think, just point my mouse in the right place. Don't underestimate the workloads. They are high, and the complexity. What can go wrong is like anything in Sod's Law. What can go wrong does go wrong. Organize early. I know, this slide again, less than 2 years remain to develop, but it's very good for consultants to tell you to get early, start paying us lots of money now. But believe me, the time will run out extremely quickly. Certainly, if you're in a business, if you're my size of company, that's quite easy. I decide quite quickly what's going to happen. In most other companies, it takes a lot longer. You have to build the business case, go and see the CEO and say, look, actually going to need this money. Is the cost going to is the business going to bear the cost? Going to budget? Build the science case and find the right science people, and then the registration dossier. People lose sight of actually the final goal, what they're after. And finding out who's going to do what for you. And obviously, the business aspects, you're in a business, so you've got to consider the business aspect. Registration is your license to operate in Europe. Okay, and I've put again the no data, no market. It's probably overused, but if you don't get the registration in and you don't get your users in, then you will not be able to market. People ask us sometimes who is going to kind of police this. There is a very strong, I'll talk about compliance at the end, but having worked in large companies companies who have signed, most of us when we sign a contract as a supplier or we're contracting with somebody for services or goods or anything else, usually sign that we're going to comply with all the law of the territory you're operating in. And I see that as the major driver of reach, ironically. I mean, yes, the Commission are doing things and there are inspections and audits, but the companies themselves are saying, oh, actually, we have a policy of complying with all known regulation, therefore, have you done this as you go through the door? The costs of REACH are highly variable, so you really need to consider what's your return on investment and what's going on. This is a slide really just to try and have a look through of understanding what are the cost implications and what factors hit the costs. If you're on the left-hand side of this, if you have all your data available or the data's in the public domain, so actually you can cite it without having to pay for it, and there are people you're sharing data with, and you've got nice agreements and you don't have any contention, you've got in there early, your substance isn't particularly hazardous, therefore you haven't got to do all the exposure work, and you haven't got many uses, then you agree the science positions quite well, and you'll probably skate through it with some pain, but that's quite good. But if you haven't got much data, or the data belongs to other companies, so you've got to negotiate with them for access to it, and you do that by negotiating, and you get another acronym, I'm afraid, another LOA, a letter of access. So it says, I've paid some money to you for the right to be able to cite that study, and that becomes because many companies, when REACH was put together, felt they were going to have all their data taken off them for free. Or if you're doing the whole thing on your own, you've got no one to share the cost with, or you get to lengthy contract discussions, and people, businessmen especially, and I'm one of them these days, who's nothing like a good contractual discussion, but it means you don't do the work, and it gets very expensive. You pay the lawyers, with all due respect to my good friends, a lot of money to put those contracts together for you. If you come in late, you're going to have a problem because you've got people wanting to, the rate it will change. You have to push more people to do the work. Because of hazards, you have many uses, and just general disagreement and bad feeling is the way to spend money. Put this slide together just to kind of say building the business case. The little man was supposed to be on his own. I quite like him, but it was kind of say when I work with businesses in REACH, some people are only too keen to jump off the cliff or into deep water without understanding how high it is or how deep it is. And I think it's very few business. So what has to happen inside a business is actually you build the business case. We always say we work with people to try and understand, to calculate the cost, to understand your return investment, to build a business case. And once you have that business case and you know what you're doing in terms of your cost basis, then you can go forward to make the dossier. Then you can make the registration from that dossier because you know how it's going to do it, and you have business continuance. But I think I've seen some people come to grief in the middle there with not really understanding what they're getting into as they go through. I'm not trying to frighten anybody off. It's very doable, but you just have to understand what's coming in terms of business planning on the way through. So in planning for 2013 and 2018, these little men are telling us really that kind of three things. First of all, you're walking a tightrope, I think, because you're trying to understand what's going on. It's a difficult thing to do. There's a vast amount of information out there, and who the heck are you going to talk to? So which chemicals to register? That's your call, trying to understand it, with your budgets and your planning. How are you going to meet the information requirements and the technical side of it? How are you going to do that? How are you going to get the proprietary data together? There's an awful lot of science stuck in there. There are things like non-science methods for producing the data, but we're getting a lot of pushback from ECHA at the moment on some of the dossiers we put together in 2010 on the methods that we used, even though we wrote the guidelines for them, and how we're going to write that dossier together, and then who shares the cost. And the question really is, how do you get started? How do you understand the cost basis and the business case going forward? We have worked with ICF a lot on these with other people, and so we try to put a kind of stick to help you really understand what the summary costs might be before you go, kind of what intrinsic hazards, what testing required, what classifier, what dossier complexity. You need to get advice on these issues if you're not used to doing it yourselves already. To understand that. These are really the major cost elements around the circle here: number of users, people management, your number of players, your dossier compilation, and obviously the cost inside your company for doing this work, There's also a huge side, of course, also, if you're a global player and you're in a global market, you almost you have to do this, because if you want to sell to somebody who wants to put your chemical into a mixture for globalization, you're in this game. So you have to understand that. We've built some tools with ICF to try and take people through some of these things. But there are things people have to work through at some stage to understand that cost basis. I've probably gone on a lot about it, but I just think it's where people really do need to start. If you don't understand your cost basis, you can get a bit lost. Of course, changing gears slightly, I just thought I'd concentrate, as Flavia said, on the legal entity in Europe a little. Obviously, an EU regulation, and I should have given it a capital R, because that's the way it should be written, so my apologies, can only apply to an EU legal entity. Obviously, we cannot, so the regulation obviously doesn't apply to any American firm or Japanese firm or Russian firm. But as they move the substance into Europe, somebody has a responsibility for each. It could be with, obviously, the EU manufacturers obviously have a issue, or it would be the importer. Now, if you're a non-EU company and you're not able to register directly, then you need to think about who is going to be that legal representative for you in Europe. And this is where this term comes from, of being the only representative. It's your representative for you on it's your surrogate legal entity in Europe. And this OR, as you're called, as representative OR, can be a UK EU affiliate. So if you're a large, you're an American corporation, you'll have EU affiliates. So the imports can be often brought, registered as the EU affiliate. And it is incredibly dependent on your business structure. I mean, there are so many different ways this is done by different companies, which country they're importing to. You'll find people who've got head offices in Rotterdam or here in Brussels, but actually it comes in through their Spanish affiliate, or it comes into the Turkish plant, and then Turkey isn't in Europe, but it comes in some other way and they sell it. Every single model you can think of like that happens one way or another. So, and this is really a shoe that doesn't fit every situation, but you have to try and make it fit. The only representative takes on that duty of the manufacturer and importer. They have responsibilities on compliance, they have responsibilities on the hazard communication, and they haven't got to share your confidential information. So, okay, I seem to have not deleted the previous slide, which is intentional. I'm going to move slightly on. I've given you here the legal text, actually, because I think it's an important one for many of you, of what the only representative and non-community manufacturer. There's three main articles here that really apply. The first one is your ability to appoint, so you can get someone appointed in Europe who's acting for you. Article 2 in this particular, Article 8, says how they have to comply and keep records, so they need to keep records in order. So they have to maintain records of how much is brought in, what the uses are, who it's sold to, as well as information on the safety data sheet referred to elsewhere in the regulation. And if you have a representative who's appointed, they have to actually inform other importers of your substances. Okay, so if you sell something in America to an American, say you were making a solvent and you sell it to an American paint company, and they brought that into Europe, technically the only representative could act for that paint importer of the paint. So you're going to find some way of keeping hold of that supply chain and keeping hold of the volumes and the information. Not easy. Okay. And the complications really come down the supply chain, and I know you talked about this on Thursday, and that's why I'd encourage you, if this is of interest to you, to make sure you attend that session. Because many of the end users, because of the complexity of who's supplying who and who has to keep hold of which volume and who tells whom. I put a slide together. We've done a fair amount of work on this over the years, and then we have systems that deal with some of this. But this little diagram, you can look at it at your leisure. I'm not going to take you through every loop of this. But potentially, if you if you're an American producer and you are somehow getting your material to Europe, you'll obviously have direct imports or direct or indirect imports, and your only representative in the slightly brownie box at the top here could keep hold of all those volumes, or they could be done individually. But how that actually all works needs to be thought through, and who is doing what in your supply chain. So it's one of the great complications, I think, for people that the regulators don't see, because all they see is a dossier at the end of the day. But your work behind the scenes is pretty considerable to try and understand the volumes. And if you're supplying downstream users in the US who are supplying downstream users in the EU, how are they going to know about the tonnages or the uses of the material that the thing you're manufacturing somewhere in the Midwest is actually being used for in Europe? It is tricky. So that's why I'm not going to go into it anymore, and it'll be dealt with more on Thursday. The work done by the only representative can be just make the registration to ECHA and pay the fees, but obviously they can take on a wider role depending on who they are and what they do. So they can have a role within the CEF and agree on the hazard assessment information and work for you. All of the things that you need to do in REACH can be done with them. Or you can have a very we'll have a legal entity, legal firm will do the work for us, they'll make the submission, we'll have legal responsibility, but we'll do the technical work and the development elsewhere. I've seen all the different models around for that. And finding an only representative, it's very dependent on what you want from them. Many do not pretend, this is not a consultant saying they don't have skills. Some of them do not pretend to have the technical skills, or they're a mailbox for the active participants, okay? But there are lots of other people who are large CROs, legal firms in the US who specialize this in Europe. I can think of a number who do this. So and some are heavily advertised, some are not. And you have to decide what you want from those people if you want a one-stop shop or you want to go somewhere else. Okay, so I'm not really saying where to go, but I think there's a variety of people offering these services to companies. Once you've got your only representative and you've got your legal side sorted out and you know who's going to represent you in Europe, REACH requires you only have one registration. And the concept is that the lead company submits all the intrinsic hazard data and the co-registrants submit their own data, i.e. their use data on such things like substance identification, and you then both register into REACH IT and refer to each other. Okay? My point on this slide really to say to people is that don't sit back and expect that somebody's always going to initiate this process and contact you, even if you have put into the IT systems. Somebody needs to take the initiative. And it may just be a phone call, it may be an email message, but someone has to kick-start. And that's what quite often is, if they're waiting for something to happen, it may not be happening. Okay. I just put a slide together, and actually I borrowed it from all the work I did in many of the major consortia to try and explain to all the CEF members. I think in low olefin aromatics, we had 37,000 CEF members, so we had a lot of explaining to do. Not all of them were active participants, but about 3,500 at the end of the day. But if you look at the grey box, it's what's put in the minimal set that's put in by every registrant. Okay, so it's the company data. That's slightly changing, but it's because ECHA are changing some of the systems. But it's a substance ID, who you are, what's your substance, your composition, your analytical data, and it must be your information, the composition and analytical data. You cannot share it because you're saying what you are putting on the market. The classification and labeling, you agree in the wider context of everybody. And your manufacturer and your use and your exposure information also is your personal information. It's your uses and your exposure. And then also you have inside your chemical safety report, you may have that, although that can be shared as well, the safety assessment. If you're non-European, you haven't got to tell them how you manufacture the thing. It's only for Europeans. So we have a shared process, and then in the joint dossier, if you like, the joint part, the lead company submits on behalf of the co-registrants, and you refer to it, the phys-chem data, the environment data, the ecotox data, guidance on safe use and toxicology seems to have dropped off the list. It shouldn't have done. and the common elements of safety data sheet. So you have in that process who is doing what for that. The way that if you are for a grey firm, you are a co-registrant, you will actually quite often pay for what is a common phrase called a letter of access to pay for the data that the other company has, or pay for the costs of putting this very extensive dossier together. The cost-sharing mechanism laid out, and people share their information. So you say, I'd like to access your study because we haven't got a repeat dose toxicity study, so I'll pay you. The study costs €30,000. There's 6 of us interested, so we're each going to pay $5,000 each. You find somebody, you share out the money, then you share the access to the study. We're very used to doing that, and we've obviously shared data through many programs. I mean, like the EPA High Production Volume Program. It's not a thing we haven't been doing in industry, but it's just more and more people are involved who have never dealt with it before. I threatened you before with saying a bit more about preparing and submitting a dossier. It is a complex process because of all the considerations of the people you have to talk to and the detail level in terms of the planning and toxicology. The technical arguments get extraordinarily detailed. They're not for the faint-hearted. You do need to have some specialist knowledge to write these dossiers. It's not just a matter of filling them in. And obviously you need to integrate about the co-registrants. This actually is taken from one of our projects, I think, of technical aspects of putting things together. And obviously someone needs to own that process within your company or within your organization to drive it and make sure it gets done. Not all projects have a happy ending, unfortunately. Flavia mentioned, and I mentioned earlier on, that the tool we use for putting all the data together once you've got to that stage, and it takes a while to get there, is this tool called Euclid. It's a large database in itself. It's been going for a long time now. We originally used it for the existing chemicals regulation in Europe in the 90s. Came from German industry originally, but it's grown to allow you to put all the data in. It produces a dossier, which is the dossier you put into ECHA, and has a thing called a technical completeness check within inside it, so you can check that you've got the dossier about right before it goes in. But it has all the fields for legal entities, so it's got literally thousands of fields inside it to fill in. If you have a toxicology study, it has all the fields to say who did what to whom, what the conclusions are, what the tissues were, what happened, all the way through. The Commission are quite often upgrading this software, and quite often you'll need the latest version to be able to make the registration. And they're at the moment integrating it with a lot of the risk assessment and exposure tools within the next year. So it's still a movable feast, really. I'm slowly going to the end, and I look at the time. That's probably a very good thing. And I've asked about 40 minutes, so I think I'm on the money. Post-registration, even when you've made your registration, you put all this documentation together, and it's inside ECHA. And I don't mean to be negative, but there is a post-registration process for demonstrating and keeping in compliance. The enforcement is high on the EU political activity. There's a forum that the Commission have at ECHA for enforcement activity, so member states are sharing information and so-called best practice. But the downstream users, quite often, if you're supplying something, are requiring more information. Some of the big motor manufacturers, some of the big furniture manufacturers, I'm not going to name, but you can probably think of, are requiring you to prove that the registration number, what the registration number is. You always want to see the dossier before they'll carry on with the contract. And actually keeping the compliance aspect of this going is no different from, to be honest, keeping in compliance with US regulation. I think it's just that we're probably not used to having to deal with it in quite the same way. But we need to keep up to date with the manufacturing regulations. If you have a change, then your dossier will have to change. So if new information comes out about the hazard of a substance, some academic suddenly publishes and says, I think, well, one of the news this morning is trichloroethylene, I guess, and there's new information on it. You have to inform the Commission and talk to them and reassess the uses and the risk management that you have proposed to the Commission to be able to sell it. And what I probably didn't say very clearly is that you can only sell chemicals in Europe when you have demonstrated their safety in use. I'm not going to say safe use, but safety in use as defined by the way that you need to do the risk assessment under the terms of this regulation. Just saying it's been used for a long time doesn't mean it. If you change the legal entity, change your own representative, you change the uses, you will need to keep those up to date. And you'll need to, audits will require you to demonstrate, that you have the policies and procedures in place to steward both the products and the processes. So it's challenging territories. And I had an old colleague I worked with, Erwin Jacobson, who, he started off, we worked on I think, one time the chemical industry was very much the trusted industry with the golden boys. We produced this wonderful quality of life for people. But then how people suddenly become more disenfranchised with it, and they want to see more and more information from us. And now we always thought, we got to the stage where we had to tell them about everything rather than just trusting us. And now they're telling us the other way around. So we're in difficult times, and there will certainly be reach creep, I think, around the world as this sort of very informative regulation goes elsewhere. So I think in global terms it's not going to go away. We're already seeing it happen elsewhere, and you also have the reassessment of TSCA going on as well. So the steps towards registration, I try to put you on a escalator or going up to the nirvana of registration and the lofty planes above that. So I just want to thank you for your attention. You couldn't escape from me because you couldn't interrupt me, which is very good. If you have any questions or further information, please let us know. Okay, with Mike, I'm going to hand back to you, I think, in about right order, I think.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mike. Mike, would you like to mention how you can be contacted directly as well?
Oh, we have a web. That's not very good for consultants, is it? My name is Mike. If you write to mike@penmanconsulting.com or info@penmanconsulting.com, Penman Consulting is all one word. It's quite easy.
Thank you very much, Mike. So we'll move on to the questions now. A couple of questions have come in, written questions that we'll ask first, and then we'll open up the line for verbal questions. First question, if a company sells a product such as a radio or GPS to be used in a car or on a tabletop in a home, and there is no intended release of a chemical, does it matter if one of the components contains an SVHC?
That's one for you, I think, Flavia, isn't it?
Flavia, are you on mute?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's a question relating to requirements for articles. The radio would be considered an article on the REACH. If there is no intended release, then there is no registration to be done. But articles are still subject to notification. So if the hazardous substances is an SVHC on the candidate list and meets certain conditions, it has to be above 1 ton and above 0.1%, then it needs to be notified to ECHA. And if the SVHC is present in above 0.1%, it should be communicated. The presence of this substance should be communicated down the supply chain to customers and consumers on request. I hope this answers the question. Mike, do you want to add anything?
No, I think you got it right. I think you had it right in your slides before. I think, and the big challenge, of course, then for manufacturers is to know if they've got SVHCs or something like that in their product and their articles, and if they do their mass balance, how you track that and demonstrate that, how you demonstrate the negative, if you get challenged by it by people.
Okay, thank you. And one other question that was written out here. If a chemical is already registered by Company A, then does Company B need to register the same chemical?
I'm afraid so, yes. The regulation applies per legal entity, okay? So, for example, the large company I used to work with when I was decided to go and do something else, if you had 14 refineries in Europe in 14 different companies all making gasoline, and they were all different legal entities, you had to register gasoline 14 times. So, which sounds crazy, but of course legally they need someone to sue. So I'm afraid, yes, if it's been pre-registered, if it has been registered by somebody else, then a lot of what I've talked about will be easy because they will have had the dossier already you can refer to, but you will need to buy into it properly.
Okay, thank you. Another written question came in before we open up the lines. Is it one registration for all substances?
I think my previous answer applies really, Mike.
Absolutely. Okay.
It is one registration per substance per legal entity. So even if you're a small company and you have a supply chain where you have 5 different importers bringing it into Europe, that technically could be 5 registrations. Now, the costs wouldn't be 5 times as much, but there'd still be 5 registration fees and 5 bits of administration to look after.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Nothing else written right now. Tanya, can you open up the line for questions, please?
Thank you. At this time, we are ready for the question and answer session. If you'd like to ask a question, please press star 1. You will be prompted to pre-record your first and last name. To withdraw your question, press star 2. One moment. We do have a couple questions. Our first one, Travis, your line is open.
Hi, thanks for taking the question. I've contacted a few OR agencies, and they are talking to us about pre-registration because we're looking to move on a product in the next couple months and getting it to the UK. So could you just let us know a little bit about the pre-registration process and what we need to do on a short time frame, like in the next 3 to 6 months?
Flavia, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, the pre-registration deadline is over. Pre-registrations were due in 2008, but if you are exporting for the first time, then you can still do a late pre-registration, and the information is quite limited compared to a full registration. Mike, maybe you could detail what should be in a pre-registration. I think it's just the name of the substance and the volume that you plan to put on the market.
Yeah, it's simply name, rank, and number. Really, it's about. There's no data requirements whatsoever, but you have to be able to say that you have not imported it into Europe before, and you have to document the negative. It's a bit like you need to have that information available.
Okay.
Our next question, Joel Sherdock, your line is open.
Yes, thank you very much. We're a small American company, and the desire of our management is to have a relatively large presence in Europe. The question we have is how do we convince our management that this is not going away? We don't have the resources of a big company. We have one regulatory specialist, and this has become a very daunting task.
What can I say? I think it is a daunting task. I mean, if you're optimistic about your business in Europe and what your products are, then I think you have to look at it seriously. To be honest with you, I would go down the line of trying to cost this out, actually, of seeing then what I said earlier about building the business case. You wouldn't do anything else in your business without actually understanding the cost basis. So I would initially and quite quickly treat it as a business hurdle like any other, like if you had a big transport issue or you had a manufacturing issue. It's the same sort of business hurdle you've got to come over to be able to continue to supply. So if you understand the cost base of what the resources are, then suddenly I think then you could lay that case in front of your management and say, this is the cost, this is the gain, and make the business case. I mean, that's what I would do in a company anyway. Well, it's easier said than done. if you want to, we have tools to do that. I'm not trying to advertise ourselves, but find somebody who genuinely understands the cost basis for this sort of process, and they'll help you through it.
Thank you very much.
Our next question, Lisa Saul, your line is open.
Hi. We attempted to export cosmetics into the Netherlands in 2002 when the European directive came out. And someone from the European FDA in Holland, I don't know what they're called, required us to present a dossier at that time. And so we went through a screening process with them. We presented a dossier, and this was before REACH or any of the other things. And at the end of this 2-year process that it took us, he finally approved us and said we basically needed to have a safety assessment, which we've had done. But now there's REACH, and do I need to start from scratch, or can I use this information that was approved in 2002?
Well, I think I understood your question, Lisa. I mean, the trouble is, if this is a cosmetic end use, as Flavia said, that end use is covered by, if you have an approval in Europe for the cosmetic side of it through the Cosmetics Directive, that's covered, but you will still need to register it for coming into Europe. You may have the right data, you may not. Without going, it's like one of these terrible things, without looking at the weeds, getting into them, it's very hard to advise you properly, but it could be they have the data, but the data requirements are quite large, or you may just be using it as an intermediate. So you need to, I'm afraid the devil is in the detail you need to work through, and you need to find somebody who can help you with that detail, again, in the planning process. How much data do you have for that submission to the Dutch authorities?
How much did I have?
Yeah. I mean, was there a lot of toxicology, environmental data, or?
Well, we had previous toxicological studies that were done by other companies for each individual ingredient. So it determined, the quantity of the ingredient and the toxicological evidence for each ingredient. We have kept up with the European directive, and so our products do not have anything that is illegal in the cosmetics. When I finished, I would say that I had probably about 3 inches worth of papers for them.
Okay, well, that's a good. It's hard to say from that. I mean, I'm glad you're in the law. It is difficult to advise without looking at the detail. But I mean, you'll have a very good start. But of course, the major thrust of a cosmetics directive is towards direct application consumer safety, and therefore you probably have a fair amount of information. You probably have a lacking of information on something like the environmental side where you need to produce a basic requirement. If you have a number of ingredients, of course, you don't register the preparation. You have to look at each individual substance you're bringing into Europe in that process. So there'd be a number of things to look through there, Lisa, I think.
So I have a Mac computer, so I'm not able to see the visuals. Is it possible, Mike, for you to spell consulting.com? I couldn't understand how to spell it.
Oh, my name really is extremely simple, Lisa. It's Penman, P-E-N-M-A-N.
Okay.
English spelling, consulting, and it's all one word.
Okay. So I'll send you an email and we can talk about this further.
Yeah, I can give you a call by all means. Yeah.
Okay.
Angelica's our cosmetic expert.
Let me, I don't know if there are any additional questions, but let me go to a couple of written questions here. One from Kathy Hester Mays. Once your product is registered with REACH, does this cover all of Europe, or do you have to register in each state?
No, ECHA is a European agency, so it covers the whole of Europe. That's as far as Europe exists at the moment, yes.
Okay, and next from Rich Sedlak. When a company buys into a CEF to gain access to studies of other companies, does that company then become a co-owner of those studies?
Completely down to the contractual arrangements the companies come to. Sometimes, because if you own you can come. We've had consortia where that is the case, and we've had where all you're doing is buying an access to that study for the purposes of REACH. If you think that, say, a lot of studies done in the U.S. over the years, and by companies in the U.S., and so they quite often will sell a letter of access for yourself to use, but it doesn't mean you have title to that study for going into Korea or Japan or anywhere else. So it's down to negotiation, discussion between the companies. Sometimes it's easier to make a global agreement, and sometimes it's much easier and quicker and cheaper to do a local one just for Europe.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Final.
It sounds very weaselly, the answers you're giving, but it's just really difficult because there's so many different factors in all these things. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Final written question for now here. Even though a chemical is registered, this may have been answered, even though a chemical is registered in NECA, then does the company still need to register that chemical?
I'm afraid so.
Okay, and Tanya, any more questions in the queue?
We do have another question. Mark Urbanik, your line is open.
Yes, the only chemical that we use internally, we're a U.S. company, we use coolant in our machines probably over a ton per year. Would that have to be registered?
Are you shipping that coolant as your importing company into Europe, Mark?
No, we're not.
If the coolant isn't going into Europe, then no.
Okay. Thank you.
But if the coolant was coming across into Europe and you're supplying coolant as part of your manufacturing machine process to your European distribution network, if you had one, then yes, you would get caught by the regulation. Companies who actually have paint on the decks of ships and move it onto the get caught. So it's really a matter of if you're bringing the chemical in.
Okay. Thank you.
Once again, if you'd like to ask a question, please press star 1.
We do have a few more minutes left, so any questions, please ask.
There are no further questions. Oh, I apologize. We do have another one. Travis Portinga, your line is open.
It's a real quick question. In terms of quantity and tonnage, is that the total formula, like if you sent over a cleaning product or a liquid soap or something like that, or is the quantity of the chemical measured by each ingredient per part?
It's each, because the regulation applies to individual substances and not to preparations or mixtures. So it's actually the substance that you want to worry about.
Okay, so when we figure our quantity, we've got to do quantity for each element of our total solution, our total product.
Absolutely, you need to do the breakback. So if you are, depending on your formulation and your bill of materials and things, you have to work on that basis.
Okay, thank you very much.
Our next question, Ramon, your line is open.
Yes, he mentioned RMM when he was speaking. Can you tell me what that means or what that stands for?
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's one acronym I didn't put in, Ramon. It's risk management measures. So a risk management measure in your occupational setting could be to put gloves on, or it could be to have exhaust ventilation, or in the environment it could be to have a sewage treatment plant. So those sorts of things. And they are varied, or it could be a label on a can. So they are varied and numerous.
Okay, thank you.
And you need to propose what the risk management measures are to make sure that the chemical is used safely.
All right, thank you.
Our next question, Ken Blum, your line is open.
Hello. We're a U.S.-based company, and we have EU REACH resources in Europe, and they're acting as our only representative. But the challenge I get sometimes is how to answer questions from customers in the U.S. Asking if our product is REACH compliant, because the answer is it depends. How do you answer that? Like if we export one of our products to Europe through our OR, we're covered, and we're tracking it, and we're monitoring it. but I can't control what my customers do.
Well, I think you say that I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I'm not a lawyer, but you have to be able to say that you supply REACH-compliant manufacturers down to your downstream users, and you must have a contract with your downstream users. They put on, they're not using it for something that you don't know about. And what you could say to your U.S. customer is these are the uses that we have registered for within Europe. So it's very clear what the uses are that you have registered for, so there's no ambiguity of what you've done. If you wanted to do that, I mean, there are confidentiality problems sometimes.
That's the problem. Many of your customers don't really want you to know what they're doing with your product because the fear that you may discover.
If your clients if customers don't want to tell you what the uses are, there is the sanction from them when they take it into Europe for them to notify the Commission what the uses are. It's like a downstream dossier way of dealing with that. But still, again, you can then say, well, these are what we've registered for. If you want to go beyond that, these are the mechanisms for doing it. But this is where we start and finish. And I think it's really uncomfortable for businesses because it's a sort of level of information that we're not used to not always exchanging with each other. You know?
Yeah, it is a challenge, and it's also a challenge that I think a lot of the customers I deal with are extremely naive about what REACH means.
I think so, yes. I think, I'm sure if it happened in North America, I think you'd have a whole stack of legal challenges, to be honest with you, but it's not the way we do it in Europe, unfortunately.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Our next question, Peter Caputo, your line is open.
Yes, hello. You may have answered this, but for clarification, I need to ask again. As a distributor, we purchase a product from a REACH-compliant product and resell it to a non-European customer. Now, their subsequent supply chain will eventually sell into Europe. But what responsibility would we have as a distributor of buying a REACH-compliant product and selling it to a non-European country?
Well, the regulation doesn't apply to them as long as you pass across the information that you would supply anyway to a downstream customer in Europe. And if they re-import it, they're technically, if they told you about the volumes, they are technically covered by your registration. So if it goes out of Europe and comes back in again, the volumes are covered, but it's very tricky to do that. So I think you're pretty well covered as you give them the same information. I don't see a problem there. So, Flavia, do you have a comment there?
If we pass on the information from our supplier, is that correct? That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay. What if we make a proprietary mixture of said products and sell it once again to a non-European country? Are we creating an article that has to be registered if we're not selling it directly?
So you're making it in Europe and then taking it out the European border, is that right?
No, we're making it in North America.
You're making it in North America, and the downstream user may take it into Europe at some stage.
That's correct.
In some form. And are you importing this into Europe as well, or not yourselves?
Not directly. No, we do not sell directly to Europe.
Well, then the responsibility will lie with the person with the first import. So technically they should know from you what's inside it and then be able to say they are going to register that material. And this becomes quite an issue, I think, especially with some American companies where, people are asking them for registrations when they're weren't even aware that their material was ending up in Europe.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
It's difficult without knowing every single detail of these cases, but the generality is if a chemical, Europe has put this regulation in place, and if a substance crosses the boundary into Europe, then supposedly REACH will apply to it, and therefore it needs to be registered. What deals are done between the downstream user in the US and the principal original manufacturer is up for them. And And I know it's an extraordinarily complicated world if you say making an additive pack that goes into lubricants, because there'll be, quite a long supply chain before it hits anywhere near the levels it goes into, Europe. So I'm not pretending it's easy, but just what the fact is, really.
Right. Understood. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ungraciously keep Mike and Flavie on for another couple of minutes because there are a couple more questions, if that's okay.
I'm going to keep talking. I'll hang myself, I think.
All right. From Dave Bolton, can you comment on the confusion with the definition of an article and what we may expect with future clarification of this issue?
I can take that one. Yeah. Well, the definition of an article is clarified in the guidance on substances in articles. The confusion is about how to calculate the presence of SVHCs in articles. I mentioned the concentration threshold of 0.1%. The Commission interpretation, and that's reflected in the guidance, is that the concentration should apply to the entire article, but some member states disagree with that and think that it should apply to, at the component level. So, of course, this is creating a lot of confusion and raising questions regarding enforcement by the different member states. I understand that the European Commission has launched an infringement procedure against France, who recently, in its official journal, officially announced its interpretation. So what we could expect in the future, I think, would be the solution in courts.
Thank you, Flavie. One more written question here. Registration is for SVHCs or all chemicals?
Well, it's for all chemicals above 1 ton, whatever, hazardous or not.
Thank you. Tanya, any more questions in the queue? Maybe we'll take a couple more.
There are no questions.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us today. I'd like to especially thank Flavie and Mike for the excellent information that they've presented on a very complex topic. Also, I'd like to thank our partner, ICF International. If you have any questions or would like to consult privately with the presenters, please feel free to do so directly, or you can let me know and I can put you in touch. Again, feel free to download the PDF versions of today's presentations by clicking the Handouts tab. It's the icon with the 3 sheets of paper on the top right. If you're planning on joining us on Thursday for Communication Challenges, CLP Transition and Supply Chain Compliance, we'll talk to you then. Again, there's unique access information for that, which you should have received if you signed up. And I'll send out a reminder again on Thursday morning with access information. There's still time to register for that session if you have not done so yet and would like to. So again, thank you all very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening.
Okay, Tanya, thank you.